A very good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to see so many of you here this evening. A very warm welcome to UCL Institute of Education, Professorial Lecture. I am Professor Lin Ang, Pro-Director and Vice Dean Research at the Institute of Education, and I'm delighted to have this privilege to chair this event. So thank you very much, each and every one of you, for joining us, whether you're here in person or online. Now, this evening's lecture is entitled Healthy Longevity in the 21st Century, a Cross-Generational Life Course Perspective. Our speaker, our esteemed speaker this evening is George Ploubidis, Professor of Population Health and Statistics based at IOE's Social Research Institute and Director of two of the nation's birth cohort studies hosted by IOE Center for Longitudinal Studies, CLS, the 1958 National Child Development Study and the 1970 British Cohort Study. Now, George joined the Center for Longitudinal Studies in 2014 as the Center's chief statistician, and in 2016, he became CLS inaugural Director of Research. He is also a multidisciplinary quantitative social scientist and a longitudinal survey methodologist. George's research interests relates to socioeconomic and demographic determinants of health over the life course and the mechanisms that underlie generational differences in health, well-being, and mortality. His methodological work tackles complex aspects such as missing data, causal inference in observational longitudinal data, and measurements in population surveys. As with many health and social researchers, the COVID pandemic is very much reflected in George's portfolio of research. He currently leads the Society and Health theme of the COVID-19 Longitudinal Health and Wellbeing National Core Study. Now, alongside this, George's wider research continues to feature in many, many media reports, which I'm sure many of you would have come across, including, among other topics, midlife mental health of Generation X's, baby boomers, multi-morbidity, and the impact of relationship status on health. Now, there isn't time here for me to mention every project and every detail of George's outstanding career, but of course I can assure you that his long list of research contributions is simply impressive. Now, I should add, when George and I met to prepare for this lecture, I mentioned how impressed I was by his very accomplished academic career. And George was very quick to respond, but I do have a life outside academia, which I hope we all do. And I was so pleased to learn that out of all the very high-flying and glamorous careers that George could have chosen, a career in politics, as a rock star in a music band, or an international basketball player, so I've heard, he chose to pursue his passion in research in the academic world. And aren't we lucky? And I'm so thrilled that he did, as I'm sure you would all agree. So George, we are absolutely delighted to be here today to celebrate your incredible achievements. Please may I invite Professor George Ploubidis to present the lecture.
Hi all. Wow. Thank you so much for the people here in the room and everybody watching online. And thank you, of course, Lynn, for the amazing, amazing introduction. Thank you so much. We have been trying to do this for a few years now. I became professor at UCL in 2016, 7 years ago. And, you know, we thought, okay, let's do this in 2018. Great, 2 years on, I would have stuff to talk about, right? But in 2018, my daughter, Lily, was born. Lily is with us tonight, and she's 5. And I thought, you know, no, I want to be involved from day one or before. Not a good idea to do it. And then we thought, June 2020. June 2020, right? It's a fantastic date. Let's do this. Well, it was a bit challenging for all of us, right? But here we are tonight, May 2023, And you may say, George, it was about time. And you would be right, because actually this is very fitting. One of the themes of today's lecture is time. Well, to be more precise, is time travel. Now, if you're thinking, oh my God, George is having a full-on academic midlife crisis, changing direction to theoretical physics. No. Well, not yet, no. Today, it's not about philosophy. It's about science. It's about data. It's about empirical evidence. It's about how a simple idea of following people, large samples of people over time, can provide us with important insights on the human condition. The second theme is generations, and how the scientific study of generational change can give us important information and knowledge on how long-term trends influence people's lives. The third theme is teams. Science in the 21st century is team science. It's not about individuals. It's about teams. And all the work, everything I will be presenting today is a product of the hard work of great multidisciplinary teams I'm very proud to be a member of. So teams. All right, so these are the three themes. Speaking about time, probably my most favorite social statistic or statistic of all time, life expectancy at birth. In the UK, in the 20th century, and a little bit on the 21st, we all know this, right? I think great success, unprecedented increase, fantastic. The social forces, public health, improved living standards, towards the end of the century, perhaps medical technology as well, great success. There were some bumps along the way, what is known now as the previous pandemic, the Second World War, but the forces that shaped this success, this increase in life expectancy, were stronger. And according at least to the Office for National Statistics projections, they will be stronger than the current pandemic as well. This is what we expect. So, looking at the increase of life expectancy from a generational change point of view, what I think is visible from this figure is that more recently born generations are expected to live longer, and they will live longer. Now, this combined, of course, with the well-known decline in fertility and the postponement of age at first birth, collectively known as the second demographic transition, led to, well, population aging, one of the most dominant trends for the 21st century. Now, so yes, we will be living longer. Great, which is fantastic, great success. The question is, how do these added years look like? Are they years of health, well-being, mobility, functioning, and so on? And I think this is an important question. It's an important question not just to us as individuals, but has, of course, broader and more important implications. Implications about the healthcare system, the labor market, and so on. So we have been doing such work, and I will give you some examples of that work, when we're simply trying to answer what I think, at least, is an important question. Yes, younger generations are expected to live longer. Fine. But are they healthier? And this is important, because if they're not, there are some consequences, some trends there. So this is one example of a paper we did a couple of years ago. Simply on this paper, we used a survey called the Health Survey for England, also housed here at UCL, really great survey. It's a survey that samples people, different people, every year. It's not longitudinal, doesn't follow people over time. So we took 20 years of data, we grouped them into generations, we statistically adjusted for age differences, and we simply asked the question, are more recently born generations healthier or not? Now, when we compare generations, the health of generations, there are really three directions of travel. Worse health means younger generations have worse health, as you look on the right, which means younger generations live longer, but they also spend more years in poor health. We don't want that. This confirms a theory called expansion of morbidity. Simply means the years with poor health expand. We don't want that. We don't want to see anything appearing here. What we want, actually, is on the other end, is better health. So younger generations have better health, which means Yes, we live longer, fantastic, but we also spend less years in poor health compared to previous generations. And this confirms a theory called compression of morbidity. So the years of poor health compress. This is what we want, and this is the scenario actually that will lead to healthy longevity, which is the theme of today's talk. The third scenario, the third direction is actually, well, if nothing appears on the left or right, it means that generations, younger and older generations, have more or less the same health. So there is a dynamic equilibrium. It's not as bad, of course, as worse health, but it's not as great as better health, because younger generations will be living longer, but spending the same number of years in poor health. So, okay, we want to see a lot of bars appearing there on the left-hand side. So what did we find? By the way, just to mention that in this study, we benefited from health outcomes being self-reported, but also measured by biomarkers. For example, diabetes is one of them. So what did we find? Not great news. For most outcomes, younger generations appear less healthy. Okay. Now, you may be thinking, all right, they appear less healthy, but what does it really mean in terms of years, right? So we're able to quantify this for all these outcomes, and I will give you the example of diabetes. So here what you see is life expectancy at age 25, so the number of years people are expected to live after they reach 25, for 3 different periods, 1993, 2003, and 2013. And life expectancy is increasing, fine. But the dark blue segment of the bar, which is the years spent with diabetes, is increasing. And it's increasing faster than the light blue segment part of the bar, which is the years lived without diabetes. And there is a similar example with all the outcomes you saw on the right side of the screen, which means younger generations have worse health. So not a very positive story. The media sometimes like negative stories sometimes, so that was picked up, fine. Now, of course, no matter how much we really love our papers, right, and we think they're great, and don't get me wrong, I'm really proud of that paper. I think it's really great, but it's a single paper. And if the generational health drift, because this is what we're observing, is an important trend. So and also in this paper, we only looked at a specific period, 20 years, and we only looked at a specific age range, the working age population. So we thought, okay, let's do a systematic review, synthesize all studies that have answered the same question in post-war UK. We found 54 such studies that have been, with different methods and different assumptions, have been answering the same question. Okay, so what did we find? Same system, worse health, not good, younger generations, worse health, left, better health, yay, this is what we want. Nothing in the middle, dynamic equilibrium, not bad, but not great either. First, results by age 16 to 64, and we present these results, I present these results by men and women as well. So, what did we find in this age group? Not good, again. Younger generations, in all these conditions, worse health. Similarly, with 2 exceptions, cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's and dementias, same pattern on those 65 plus. Okay, so based on this evidence and other work we have done, we believe that there is a generational health drift. Younger generations, despite expected and will be living longer, are less healthy. Now, it's interesting that this happened while some improvements were happening in parallel. For example, smoking. We know that the smoking pandemic has been saturating. We smoke less. Younger generations smoke less. It's interesting because, of course, we know that smoking is one of the leading causes of health and mortality. Another interesting finding, I think this generational health drift is not some form of UK exceptionalism. We found similar findings in Sweden. Recently, there are similar findings in the US and some European countries as well. So it's not just the UK. So we do have a generational health drift. Now, there are some questions there, I think. Why? Why did it happen? How? And I think most importantly, what can we do to reverse it? What can we do to reverse the generational health drift? this is where I think the life course approach, and more importantly, life course data, especially a cross-generational life course approach with data from various generations over the life course, can help us to answer some questions that actually no other design, no other data can answer. And of course, we're very lucky in the UK because we happen to have such data. The first, and I think the first question to begin, and the most important question to me at least, is, okay, there is a generational health drift, but at which life stage does it begin? Is it confined in late life? Is it early? Is it midlife? And actually, for which generations and for which outcomes? Is it the same or different? So this is one, I think, important question, set of questions at least, to describe and understand the phenomenon that can help us to look for something else. But of course, we want to describe the world, we want to understand the world, but we also want to change the world. So we want to look for causal effects. We want to look for things that can change, that can reverse the generational health drift. Having data across life means we have data, we have information on people's lives before the onset of illness, which means we can identify factors that have, under assumptions, a causal effect on the onset of illness across generations, and we can identify whether actually these factors are the same or different across different generations. Independent of illness, having data across life from various generations allows us to identify factors over the life course that are related with important outcomes in later life linked to healthy longevity. For example, such as physical functioning, cognitive functioning, social participation, and overall quality of life and well-being. Now, the cross-generational life course perspective is very powerful, but I think we need to combine it with a classic idea from epidemiology to fully grasp what the generational health drift means for people's lives. So, in very simple terms, this idea, of course, is the idea from Jeffrey Rose about sick individuals and sick populations. This is simply the distribution of risk. This is simply the age of onset of illness. If you're an epidemiologist or into those things, this is the incidence, the distribution of incidence on people's lives. What we really want to do is this. We want to push this distribution towards later life. This will reverse the generational health drift. This is what we want to do. We want to push that distribution. Actually, we want to do this. We want to not only push the distribution towards later life, we want to compress that distribution of risk. So less people suffer from chronic illness and so on. Problem is, because of the generational health drift, what has been happening is the other way around. That distribution has been trickling down on earlier life stages, while the life course is expanding because life expectancy is increasing. So you have two things moving in different directions. The distribution of the onset going that way, earlier in life, life expectancy increasing, the years of poor health increase. This is what this means for people's lives. Now, of course, as I mentioned, and many people in the room know that in the UK, we're very lucky. We have the series of the national birth cohorts and other cohort studies with data from early on and across life, so we can actually empirically answer those questions. Now, and one additional question I think related to this that we can answer is about the antecedents, the things that drive the generational health drift, but also its consequences. Now, speaking of consequences, you may be thinking, okay, George, it's a nice trend, maybe, but is it kind of only a statistical thing, right? Does it mean anything for people's lives? What difference does it make? Well, I think it started having some impacts, but before I give you an example, I'm going to make a prediction, right? Hopefully, we're recording this, so hopefully my future self is not watching this in 10 years and saying, oh my God, George, did you really have to make a prediction? But what's the fun? What's the fun? I mean, doing a professorial lecture and not doing a prediction. Come on. So, future George, it's fine. Don't worry. All right, so the prediction. Now, this is the slide, the similar slide from before, the ONS, Office for National Statistics projection for life expectancy. Up until 2020, this is what we observe, and then this is the projection. The dotted line captures what has been observed before the pandemic, for 10 years before the pandemic. where life expectancy stopped increasing or stagnated. Now, there has been a lot of debate on this, with austerity, harsh austerity that was implemented being one of the contributing factors. And I agree, I think it is. However, I find it difficult to decouple the generational health drift, which includes, of course, the obesity epidemic, from this. More to the point, here comes the prediction. The projection of life expectancy increasing includes a slowdown, perhaps visible on this figure. Slowdown meaning that life expectancy will not increase as much as it used to before 2010. If we don't reverse the generational health drift or mitigate its impacts, I think the generational health drift will be a contributing factor to this. Will be a contributing factor to the slowdown of life expectancy or even stagnation. But for all of that, we need more data. We need more data. We'll wait and see, collect more data, and do empirical work and see whether the projection is, my prediction is correct or not. I have one example now, though, that I think is happening now as we speak. It's kind of now. It's not my last slide. It's not my last slide. I'm not quitting, guys. So you may have heard of the Great Resignation, which is a phenomenon, a trend, which has been observed. Well, it started being observed during the pandemic. It's the idea that people resign, quitting. Recently, in the UK, this has been the focus mostly on Generation X or baby boomers. And baby boomers, you know, they have started retiring or about to retire and so on. There are some very important questions there. First of all, okay, did this trend start during the pandemic? Is the pandemic thing? Another important question is, okay, what drives this? What are the drivers of this important trend? Luckily, we do have some great data from a birth cohort called the National Child Development Study, which I happen to lead, okay, conflict of interest there, but it's great data. And these baby boomers will be retiring soon, and we have data from across their lives, so we can answer all these questions. And this is work analysis that has been happening very recently, but I thought I would present this because I find it really a very good example of a consequence of the generational health drift. So, let's do this. This is the percentage of this cohort at age 55 in 2013, 76.6% that were employed. That's 2013. That's before the pandemic, before Brexit, you name it, different world, 2013. Age 55. Okay. What happened to the same people at age 62, 7 years later, just before the pandemic? What happened? Let's take a silent guess for a second. If you're sitting next to Vanessa Moulton, who did the analysis, Vanessa, don't tell anyone. Okay, silent guess, yeah? We're on it? Yeah. When I saw this, we saw this for the first time, I said, we couldn't believe it. We thought, okay, there's something there. Let's do the analysis. No, actually, this is it. So this already gives us one important answer, that this trend, the Great Resignation, hasn't started because of the pandemic. It has been happening before the pandemic. Now, okay, what happened during the pandemic? Yes, it continued. Now, the statisticians and the modelers in the room, if you want to fit some curves over there and say, okay, it has been accelerated a little bit and so on, yeah, right, maybe. But actually, it's a phenomenon that started before the pandemic and continued during the pandemic. Now, what drives this? And that's important. Well, there is a story of socioeconomic advantage there. People from cohort members, participants from socioeconomic advantaged backgrounds in early life that had private pensions, also they were owners of the houses outright and relatively high income, choose to retire. This is one story there. Of course, remember, these are the people that will live longer and on average have better health. So there's a story of socioeconomic advantage there. But long-term illness in midlife, before age 55, is also a contributing factor, mostly in men. Now, what this means is that the generational health drift in baby boomers brought the onset of long-term illness a bit earlier in life compared to previous generations. the silent generation, and so on. And that has started to have an impact on, in this case, economic activity. Now, when something has an impact on the economy, we hear about it, right? So I think we will be hearing more about it, but I think it's an interesting finding. But, okay, these are the baby boomers. Great. What about Generation X? How is the health of Generation X? What's happening with Generation X? This collection of press and so on captures a lot of work I've been doing in the last 5 years, or a bit more actually, comparing the health of Generation X with baby boomers in midlife. Consistently, Generation X have worse health, either in physical health, things like obesity, mental health, and so on. There's one exception, which is hypertension, by the way. Aside of hypertension, in everything else, Generation X does worse. This has an important implication that the divergence between Generation X and the previous generation, the generational health drift, is present in midlife, which means it must have started somewhere earlier. And this is something that only the cohorts can tell us. Now, you may be thinking, okay, Generation X have worse health, fine, but what does it mean? What kind of numbers are we talking about? How important it is? Well, we try to answer this question by looking at multimorbidity, which is an outcome which is very clinically relevant. It means having 2 long-term conditions, with one of them being, at least one of them, 2 or more long-term conditions, with at least one of them being a physical health condition. And in this paper, the first thing we wanted to do is to quantify how many people in midlife, in Generation X, at age 46, have multimorbidity. 1 in 3. It's 1 in 3. Which is quite a lot, I would say. It's a bit more than we expected. So 1 in 3. Now, yeah, there are a bit more headlines there and so on, but I think this by itself, just the prevalence, that's this number, that 1 in 3 have multimorbidity, has some implications, and has some implications, I think, for prevention. The NHS health check is available as we speak to those 40+. Now, if we know that in midlife, 1 in 3 people have multimorbidity, maybe it's a good idea to bring this a little bit earlier, especially if the generational health drift will continue. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that because of a single paper we should change policy. Of course not. But at least, I think because this is this is the best estimate we can have in the country for multimorbidity in midlife. That's the largest sample we have. At least we can have a dialogue about it. We can start having a dialogue about this. However, prevention is great, fantastic, but I want to do more. I don't want to just do prevention. Remember, we want to change the world. We want to look for factors that drive the age of onset of illness and change them, intervene. And you know what? The remarkable data we have from the birth cohorts allow us to do this, and they allow us to travel back in time, go back in early life, at birth, or generally on early life, and find out whether some modifiable factors are actually linked with multimorbidity risk in midlife. And we did this in this paper, and I will give you some examples of what we found. So first of all, this is parental social class at birth in 1970, and multimorbidity risk 46 years later. Social class, professional, the more advantaged social class, to the more disadvantaged, to those unskilled. Anything you see from the red line on the right means more risk of multimorbidity 46 years later. So this is the social class of the father of the cohort member at birth. What you see there, you see a social gradient, which is a finding which is repeated not only in the cohorts but in other data sets as well. What I think is a stark finding is that those in the 2 more disadvantaged groups have 40% relatively more risk for multimorbidity in midlife 46 years later. So that finding, I think, gives us some ideas where to look for. Inequalities is one good example. We looked at other factors, affective symptoms at age 16. They increase the risk of multimorbidity. Ditto for body mass index at age 10. but cognitive ability is a protective factor. So these findings give us some idea of where we can look at in present generations to do more science, and indeed we have similar findings, I think we do, and intervene, improve health, push back the distribution of risk, and so on. So far, the examples I gave were most or all of the outcomes I have presented work on were physical health outcomes. But of course, we know that there is no health without mental health. And in the birth cohorts, we have been doing a lot of work on mental health. Not we, not just me, but there is a huge tradition of great work on mental health in the cohorts for many, many years. I will start with some recent work highlighting secular trends in early life mental health, comparing mental health in adolescents at age 16. So, this is emotional problems at age 16 in 4 different generations. This reported by the mothers. And I think you can see there a very clear trend. Baby boomers, Generation X, millennials more or less on the same level, but Generation Z, there is a sharp increase. And this is a finding, that has been shown in other data sets too, although the unique contribution here is that we can go back in time and compare with various different generations up to baby boomers. Of course, this secular trend, this spike, this increase of emotional symptoms at age 16 in adolescents on Generation Z, on Gen Z, combined with, well, what is relative underinvestment at best on NHS can lead to this, which of course is part of the well-known mental health crisis. Now, of course, early life mental health is important in itself, right? And we should be intervening to improve early life mental health anyway, because it's an important outcome in itself. But when it comes to healthy longevity and taking the long view and later life, there is much more to it. A consistent finding, repeated time and again, in all these generations, is that early life mental health is linked with various outcomes in adulthood. Mental health, physical health, mortality, obesity, health behavior, but also employment, education, partnership status. So, and this is a very robust finding that we observe in all these generations. It is there. There's so many papers on this, I couldn't make a summary slide. I did my best, but it wasn't possible, so summary there. But, however, there is more to it. There is more to it, because we know early life mental health, first of all, is socially patterned. It's on the causal pathway that links early life's economic disadvantage with many of those outcomes. It is also on the causal pathway that links adverse childhood experiences with many of those outcomes. Which means if we intervene on and improve early life mental health, which we should do, of course, we will also be mitigating the impact of various forms of early life disadvantage. There is one more piece of this puzzle that I think makes the case very, very strong. We know from recent work that the impact, and I'm using causal language on purpose here, the impact of early life mental health on adult outcomes is becoming stronger in more recent generations. In this case, Generation X compared to baby boomers. Taking all this information into account, I think there is a very strong case for early life mental health for improving early life mental health being one of the necessary conditions in order to achieve healthy longevity. By improving early life mental health, because we know it impacts all these outcomes in adulthood, we will be able to shift the distribution of risk, perhaps compress the distribution of risk as well, and achieve healthy longevity. However, of course, mental health is a lifelong journey. It's not just in early life. And we have been doing a lot of work on this. This is an example of one paper where we looked at psychological distress in adulthood. And this is 3 generations, 2 generations of baby boomers. The red line born in 1946, green line born in 1958, and Generation X, the blue line. One thing you may notice there is that Generation X has more psychological distress. So there is a generational health drift there. Interestingly, when we were comparing just now the early life mental health of Generation X with baby boomers, we couldn't observe a difference. So something happened between age 16 and age 25 or so there. So there is a generational health trend over there, mental health trend in this case, but perhaps you have already observed this. Midlife being a period of peak distress. Here it's called midlife crisis. I wouldn't know. Yeah. So there is, and of course, that thinking of the generational health drift and midlife being a peak distress, in this case, heightened distress period, maybe there's also a good case of thinking about midlife mental health as one of the areas we should intervene. I must say, though, there is much less work on midlife mental health, on its consequences. Yes, we can theorize and hypothesize that it will have an impact. There are plausible mechanisms of action and so on, but there is less work. But it's quite possible. Now, of course, the pandemic happened, or is happening still. And, you know, every time Lily asks me, Daddy, what did you do during the pandemic? I very proudly respond, data collection. Well, I'm very proud of this data collection. But so in this case, what we did, and by the way, this was the first time ever where data were collected from all the UK's national birth cohorts. And that makes me very happy, I must say. Very, very happy. So what is important about this COVID-19? Because there were many COVID-19 surveys, right? But what is very important about these surveys is that, first of all, in all these different cohorts, all these different generations, we have all this previous information on people's lives. And that is of vital importance for substantive work, but also when you think about methods and sample selection and so on. What is very important is we have this prior information. We embedded those surveys into these long-standing studies. Now, how is this linked with healthy longevity? Well, this is a recent paper. In a sense, it's the follow-up paper from the one I just presented on the trajectories of psychological distress, where we brought in the pandemic information and want to find out what happens on those long-term trajectories of psychological distress. It's a bit of a dramatic headline. And by the way, forgot to mention, the tigers have nothing to do with the paper. but I think they look cool. And also, you know, they may soften the blow or something, but yeah, it's so second midlife crisis. Okay. Now, 3 generations, yellow line, Generation X, blue line, baby boomers born in 1946, green line, baby boomers born in 1958. And the dotted line denotes where the pandemic happened, really, when the pandemic happened. The x-axis has, you know, its calendar year. You see in all these 3 cohorts, all these 3 different generations, there is a spike. There is an increase. Now, the fact that we have all this information across life allows us to see two things really there. First of all, that yes, there is a spike, but this spike either equaled or surpassed the previous high point, which was in midlife. Furthermore, this spike also disrupted the ongoing trend. It wasn't where things were going. Of course, we don't have another planet, a counterfactual planet, where the pandemic didn't happen, so we can be certain, but 3 generations, period effect during the pandemic, and the spike surpassed the previous peak, and it disrupted the previous trend. The inference, the best explanation, at least to me and the great team we work together, is that this is because of the pandemic. The pandemic disrupted long-term trends in psychological distress. And of course, that may have implications for future healthy longevity. If you're wondering what happened to millennials or Generation Z, their mental health, and whether indeed the pandemic did accelerate generational differences, because really today what I'm talking about is generational differences, really. We did this work, and we capitalized on the pre-pandemic information. And what we simply said is, fine, we have all this pre-pandemic information. If we statistically control for all these observed differences in mental health, physical health, socioeconomic position, demographics, you name it, are any differences during the pandemic between generations remain? Do any differences remain? So, this is depressive symptomatology adjusted for pre-pandemic generational differences. So we try to take away all the pre-pandemic differences, and this is what remains. These are 3 time points in the first year of the pandemic where we did our surveys. 5 generations, you see Generation Z, the highest depression score, baby boomers doing best, lowest depression score, Generation X somewhere in the middle, millennials close to Gen Z. Now, this is what is left after we have controlled for any pre-pandemic difference we can observe, which led us to conclude that indeed the pandemic did accelerate pre-pandemic existing differences, in this case in depression, generational differences in depression, and we have similar results for anxiety. Okay. So, up until now, I have given various examples on various outcomes and the generational health drift, some consequences, maybe some things that we can do to reverse it. Of course, much more work is needed. It's a very important trend. All the outcomes I have presented, mental health, physical health, obesity, all of those, of course, are very socially patterned. So I would like to focus a little bit on health inequalities, because I think meaningfully reducing, well, we want to eliminate health inequalities, right? There is a moral case there, obviously. But meaningfully reducing health inequalities is, I believe, a necessary condition for us to achieve healthy longevity. Is a necessary condition for us to push that distribution towards later in life and so on. Now, of course, health inequalities are observed in later life. They're observed in later life. When we observe inequalities in later life as we speak, we're talking about baby boomers, and we're talking about the silent generation and so on, predominantly. Of course, health inequalities in later life do not appear magically. It's a lifelong process. So I think it's a good idea to see, okay, what happens, how is the state of health inequalities in the most recent generation that are starting their adult years, Generation Z. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This one is from the Deaton review. It's one of the, this is a sweeping analysis of inequalities and so on, but there is one example that stands out for me. So this is inequalities in cognitive development in Generation Z, born in the year 2000, at age 3. And this is the percentage in the top quintile of cognitive attainment. Now, we present this by various characteristics, either the cohort member or their parents. What I think is very visible there, and quite shocking maybe, is that we have a history of divergent destinies, especially if you see this by maternal education or income, divergent destinies. And this is at age 3. Obviously, or not obviously, but it doesn't stop there. We did a recent paper looking at adverse outcomes, health and educational outcomes, at age 17. Same generation, Generation Z, but age 17. So, these are the 5 outcomes: psychological distress, obesity, poor academic achievement, poor health, and smoking. And we look at those individually, but also how they cluster together. Now, and we look at them by income. Highest income, which is the reference group, towards lowest income, the most advantaged income status, let's say. Now, if you look at individual outcomes, all of them socially patterned, poor academic achievement the worst one, the most socially patterned, with, of course, those with lower income gradually doing worse, having more risk for all of those outcomes. But in life, sometimes things group together. It's not just one thing. And when we do this, and for example, when we look at participants having 4 or 5 of those outcomes, the social patterning is, well, stark. Those in the lowest 20% of income are 12 times more likely to have 4 or 5 of those adverse outcomes. So health inequalities are stubborn. They haven't gone away. They're still there in this generation, in previous generations, and so on. And you know, that has led a lot of thinkers across the years to declare that the welfare state is a failure, has failed. The welfare state has failed. Because it hasn't eradicated poverty, because look at this, I mean, come on, of course. And this is not just, of course, in the UK. We observe inequalities everywhere in the world, and so on, even in places where you don't expect inequalities, but there are. So there is this thinking that the welfare state has failed. I see the glass half full, although I sympathize with the view. I see the glass half full. And I see the glass half full because I think what the welfare state has been doing in the last 20 or 30 years or so, 40 maybe, is playing a catch-up game with forces that exacerbate inequalities, and then the welfare state comes in and tries to mitigate and, you know, make inequalities less wide, you know, kind of narrow it down. It tries to narrow down inequalities. One good example of this, of some state intervention that did this, is during crisis. And 3 years ago, exactly 3 years ago, we were just about to go out of the first lockdown, I think, end of May, more or less. So at that time, 1 in 6 people in this country were on the furlough scheme. So the state was paying 80% of their salary of 1 in 6 people. And the furlough scheme was a great success, economically, in the sense that it protected people's incomes. But it also protected population health, because it helped and inequalities did not exacerbate. One example is from this work when we looked at various social and mental and social well-being outcomes. We compared those furloughed to those in stable employment with those that lost their job and those in stable unemployment before and during the pandemic. What you see there is those furloughed, yes, have a bit more risk compared to those that were working, so furlough wasn't as good as work, but they have much less risk of any of those outcomes, adverse outcomes, compared to those that lost their jobs or to those that were in stable unemployment. So a massive state intervention, in this case, helped, and inequalities weren't further exacerbated. Great. You may tell me, fantastic, let's do this in times, let's do more of that. Let's bring in more welfare state. And I would say, yeah, fine, okay, great, we should do that. We need more efficient welfare state. But I'm a little bit pessimistic, I must say. I'm a little bit pessimistic. And you know, being pessimistic, for those that know me, it's not exactly me. Yeah, so I'm a bit pessimistic. Why? I'm a bit pessimistic because actually one of the most consistent, robust findings from the birth cohorts. One of the most consistent findings. Well, early life matters. Who shapes our early life? Our parents. And it's not only our early life, our parents' influence have a profound influence on what happens to us across adulthood. Why? Well, they bring in all these dimensions of influence. Their job, the social class, of course, education, their education, income, wealth, housing wealth. Yeah, very important in this country and elsewhere, housing wealth. How big is the house we live, which is related, in which area is the house we live. It doesn't stop there. Their social capital, and of course their cultural capital. All these dimensions. And of course, because today we're talking about health and healthy longevity, and this is about health inequalities, you know, our parents share with us their genes as well. And depending on the health outcome of interest, genes may also have some additional contribution to what happens to us later on. Of course, in addition to the dominant impact of all the social, economic, and environmental dimensions I mentioned. So the family, our parents, have a profound influence across life. And the welfare state comes in and tries to weaken that link. That's what it does, really. It tries to weaken that link, to give people equal opportunities. It tries to weaken the link. This is where I'm a bit pessimistic. I'm not sure, actually, that the welfare state by itself will deliver on that. I think it needs something extra, some extra oomph, maybe, some help. Well, what I think we need is a new social contract for the 21st century. A social contract that recognizes the idea of the common good as a central component on how we allocate resources. How we allocate material resources, but also status and esteem. The idea of the common good is not bounded by traditional distinctions between the state and free markets. It's universal. It's about how we produce economic output in mixed economies with the state and free markets, and it has implications for important challenges in the 21st century. Not just population aging, but climate change, and of course, our ability to harness the power of artificial intelligence for the common good. I have no dilemmas about the common good as being something very, very important that we need to bring in if we want to meaningfully reduce inequality, in this case, health inequalities, and maybe eliminate health inequalities and inequalities in general. But I will share with you a couple of dilemmas I had while I was preparing this presentation. It was difficult. This started with 186 slides. Good fun. And there were very many dilemmas. I know a lot of people in the audience here today in the room and online perhaps expecting to talk about methods. And I thought, yeah, good idea. I will talk about my manifesto for causal inference in observational data. I have a manifesto. Or maybe should I talk about my theory of social change, the macro-social Markov chain? It's fitting, social change. But all these dilemmas, there was one more complication, guys. One more complication. This guy. George from the past. So he's all right. I mean, one thing, he has a bit too much hair on his head, right? What's that about? Anyway, some of you knew him, so he was all right, and so on. Anyway, that's a photo 11 years ago. So he was, George from the past. He was attending a lot of professorial lectures from many people, right? And he was going there, and sometimes he was feeling a little bit anxious in the back, like, oh my God, how am I ever going to do this? And he promised to himself that if he ever gets to do a professorial lecture, he will talk a little bit about how he got here. So, I decided not to break his heart and keep the promise. So, in the words of David Byrne of the Mighty Talking Heads, how did I get here? The origin story. So how did I get here? So, I was born in Athens, Greece, in 1975. Now, I think it's a good idea to think about, well, it's linked, I think, really well with what I presented today. It's to think a little bit about the historical context and the macro level, what was happening when I was born. This is GDP per capita, average income, in Greece and the UK, for comparison purposes, by the different generation. The dotted line there is when I was born in 1975. Now, the point I'm trying to make there is that Generation X was actually a bit lucky compared to other generations. Greece, for example, compared to baby boomers and the silent generation before then, Greece was a poor country back then. And not relatively poor, there was poverty. Not only that, the Greek Civil War ended in 1949. Democracy was established, but to a large extent, it was democracy in name only. There was a lot of persecution of ideas and people, so they were turbulent times. They were really turbulent times. So opportunities were much less. For baby boomers and the silent generation. But in 1974, a year before I was born, democracy was established in Greece. And since then, you know, it's the most long-lasting democracy we ever had. Stable, which is good for everybody and for Generation X. More to the point, in 1980, Greece became a full member of what was then known as the European Community, which was a very good thing for Greece, if you ask me. And in 1981, a progressive, democratic socialist party was elected, and Greece began to modernize. And all of that was very good for Generation X. That was great. Certainly, Generation X, we had on average many more opportunities compared to baby boomers and the silent generation. Fast forward 40 years later, Eurozone debt crisis, right? Of course, the economy in Greece had many structural problems. It's partly of our making, yes. But at the same time, the way the European Union handled this is not one of its proudest moments. And I'm saying this as a fan, okay? Sometimes the harshest criticism comes from fans, actually. What this means, you see this decline. You see this decline on average incomes, of course, unemployment, high unemployment, and so on. This means that millennials and Generation Z had much less opportunity. So, Generation X, no, less opportunity, not as bad as baby boomers. Greece is very different, but certainly less opportunities on average compared to Generation X. So, from a macro-social perspective, Generation X, which I'm part of, we won the macro-social lottery. Great. But what about my life? What about the life course, right? The thing I'm preaching here today. What about, you know, my life? So, as I said, I was born in Athens in 1975. I grew up in the west suburbs of Athens. For those of you not familiar with the social geography of Athens back then, these were the working class suburbs. They have been gentrified since. They will be gentrified more now. The tube is coming, guys. Very good. I attended state schools in the area. Now, all the way. Now, if you're thinking this is a story of disadvantage, it's not really. It's a story of relative advantage. Because my parents, both of them highly educated, with very good jobs, well paid, but most importantly, loving, caring, supportive, all the way through. All the way through. Not only that, I have an extended family watching online. Hi, guys. All of them very supportive, caring, loving, and so on. That extended family includes various academics as well in Greece. So the point here is, from a macro-social, macro perspective, and in my own start in life, I was very lucky. All these things I just mentioned create a profound influence on what has happened to me, but have nothing to do with my abilities, have nothing to do with me. I was just there. I was born into it. It just happened. I was born in Greece in 1975, in a specific family, and actually both things actually worked really well for me. Very lucky. I will move on to much more recent times very swiftly, very swiftly. I promise you I will not bore you with my life story. No fear, no fear. But before I do that, please allow me a moment to do this to thank my parents. Please allow me to do this to thank my parents. So I will start with my dad. I will start with my dad because he left this planet 11 years ago. So this is my father, Vasilis Ploubidis. And this is my mom. My mom is here tonight with us. No? And this is my mom, Despina Tuda. And you know, guys, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be here on the planet without them, but I wouldn't be here standing in front of you without them. They have been supporting, loving, and caring all the way, all the way, all the way. Even until today, actually. So, ευχαριστώ μαμά και ευχαριστώ μπαμπά. Thank you, Dad, wherever you are. All right, okay. Swiftly moving to more recent times. Yes, that's me, by the way. If you want. Yeah. I was wearing hats from early on. Very cool. Very cool. It's not the hairless, guys. It's not the hairless. So, let's move on to more recent times. 2004. I came from Greece. I had a thirst for knowledge. And I became an associate at Darwin College at Cambridge, in the Department of Psychiatry, where I met Tim Crowders. Tim Crowders, whatever I spoke today about mental health, latent variables, what Tim calls psychometric epidemiology, I know Tim is watching online, his whole team, but most importantly, his kindness and his support. I wouldn't be here without him. Thank you, team, and thank you for your patience as well. Thank you. 2007, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, this school. I met Emily Grandi. Emily is with us tonight. So, here tonight. Come on, guys, I mean, today it was all demography, right? I mean, obviously. So, Emily introduced me to demography. And I have learned so much from Emily, from her knowledge and wisdom. But, guys, it was the most important thing was Emily's kindness and support all through the years. I would never have been able to be here in front of you without Emily. Thank you, Emily. Thank you so, so much. Before I move on, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at what was then called the Center for Population Studies, the mighty Center for Population Studies, now the Population Studies Group. Yeah? I spent 7 fantastic years there, and I have benefited, and thank you so much, guys. It has been a blast, really. My luck didn't stop there. During the first year at this school, I met Bianca De Stavola. Bianca is watching online. Bianca is on holiday, guys, in Crete. You should visit. Crete is a good place. I think the best part is the west, but it's a very good place. Ciao, Bianca. Well, come on. I mean, everything I know about life course methods, advanced methods in epidemiology, it's all Bianca, obviously. Bianca helped me quite a lot to formalize my thinking in statistics. Every time I say this to Bianca, she says it doesn't so, George, but you know. But most importantly was Bianca's kindness, support, all the way, and obviously I wouldn't be here without Bianca. So thank you, Bianca. Enjoy Crete. And then, 7 years later, the Center for Longitudinal Studies, home, my academic home, for 9 years. And this is a lovely photo, I think. You know, the sun is shining, because, you know, the sun always shines on CLS, I must say. You might say, come on, George, CLS just next door in London, right? The sun always shines. I think it's a fitting metaphor, because CLS is a very supportive, positive environment, an environment where micro-kindness dominates the day. And that's very important. I have benefited immensely in those 9 years at CLS. It has been a blast. I would like to thank all my colleagues from all teams, research, operations, everybody, all my colleagues, many of you are here tonight. I would like to thank all of you. I would never have been here without all my colleagues at CLS. It has been great, and I really, really hope that we continue to work to do this at CLS for many, many, many years to come. Okay, towards the end of the lecture, the main reason why I did this, kind of how did I get here, is really in case this is useful perhaps to early career researchers. And I can see a lot of early career researchers here, hopefully online, and thank you guys. That makes me really happy. And they're my 2 cents to early career researchers. I mean, probably you have noticed a common pattern there. There is a common pattern, positive environments, positive supportive environments. They can go a long way. If possible, try to find people that don't only care about the project at hand, but care about your aspirations, and they can act as mentors as well as line managers. I think that can go a long way. It has worked massively well for me. Positive environments. That's vastly important. The other thing I would like to say to early career researchers is how impressed I am by your work. I read a lot of papers, and not only people that work at CLS. You guys are amazing, of course. Not only at UCL. I read a lot of papers. That's one of the fun parts of the job, by the way, reading papers. Scientific publications. I'm so impressed by the work of early career researchers. I would never have been able to do such high quality work when I was an early career researcher myself. You guys are miles better than me, miles better than me. You can achieve all this and much more than this. You're great. Believe in yourselves. I know that we have our problems in academia recently. Maybe job security, or if I say job insecurity, maybe. But these are not features of the system. They are bugs. Let's fix them together. Let's do this. These are all my co-authors, the people I have published papers, book chapters, reports, everything with. Thank you all. I have learned so much from you. You have been amazing. I'm really sorry I didn't have the time to mention all those names, but you are there, and you will forever be there because this is recorded, so people will be looking at this GIF forever. I thought this is better. Thank you so much all. So, We're almost there, guys. We made it. We're almost there. We're almost there. We're almost there. We're almost there. Thank you, Natasha. Almost there. We made it. So I would like to take a moment and thank the participants of the cohorts of all the studies. Without the generosity of the participants, the generosity with their time and their trust, we wouldn't be here. The contribution that the cohort participants have made to science is immeasurable. Thank you, huge thank you to the participants. We wouldn't be here without you. Huge thank you to the participants and the cohort members. We are here today because visionary colleagues in the past, some of them here in the room, took the long view for the common good and decided to collect data, longitudinal data across time. And of course, I think one of the messages of today's talk is that it's not really possible to do meaningful science for the present if we don't understand people's life stories and how these interact with long-term trends. And because we have in the UK this remarkable research, unique in the world, there's nowhere else. UK is actually #1 on this. True story. There's nowhere else that has this series of BERT cohorts. Because of that, time has been on our side. But for time to continue to do so, we need to collect more data from the existing studies in the existing generations, and importantly, from future generations. New studies from future generations. I'm confident that if we do so, scientists of the future will be able to harness the power of longitudinal data, the sheer power of longitudinal data, and improve people's lives in the 21st century and beyond. You have been a wonderful audience here tonight and online. That's it from me. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, George, thank you so much, and I'm sure we all agree, for that really, truly fascinating, thought-provoking, and also that very touching and special presentation, and lecture. I'm going to move us swiftly on to say it is customary for our professorial lectures to have a brief response, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce one of our IOE colleagues, Alyssa Goodman, Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Longitudinal Studies. And as Director, Alyssa leads the nation's longitudinal cohort studies, and they are just regarded as the jewel of the crown of the UK social science. So I'm really pleased, Alyssa, to invite you to give the response.
Thank you. I know I need to make sure I have the clicker before I do that. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you need to...
There we go. So thank you, Lynn, and obviously thank you very much, George. Now, I had to wait for the green light to go on. The green light is on. Okay, excellent. So, thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much, George, for your absolutely fantastic talk and for asking me to be your respondent. It's a huge honour. So as George mentioned at the start of his talk, this lecture was a very long time in the coming. And I rediscovered that as I went through my email correspondence about the talk. As George said, just a few major events got in the way of his lecture happening at the time when it was originally planned. Not least of which, and of course very specially so, the birth of a beautiful Lily. And Lily, I hope you enjoyed Daddy's talk, and cousin Constantine as well. Spoiler alert, there's lots and lots of photos in this presentation. So this is just the first. But so for my response, I'm going to start just by saying a few words about George's talk itself. And I'll also go into a bit more depth than George was able to about some of the other major areas of his work that he didn't cover today. And so these two are a little bit serious, but I will keep them brief. And then there's a bit that I'm sure everyone, including George, is most looking forward to, where I'll finish by saying a few words about George himself. So First of all, about George's talk. So for me, this was an absolute tour de force of George's work. And of all the people that I know, he manages to combine three elements in his research in a really unique way. So the first, as you will have heard, he's a very big thinker about some of the major issues facing us in our society and in population health. Second, he combines this with an incredibly deep and rigorous application of applied statistical methods to address those issues and questions. And thirdly, and importantly, there's a massive ethical component to his work. He's always thinking about social problems from the lens, as you heard, of changing the world, making things better, and also the lens of social justice and what I termed, before I heard his talk, in terms of collective responsibility, but you also heard him talking about the common good. And so, George, just jumping to the end of my talk briefly, I think these three things, being a very big thinker, really exceptionally technically minded, and the importance that you place on collective responsibility and your deep moral values, they also characterize you personally, as well as in how you do your research in a really important way. So, given the breadth and the depth of his talk, I think it's amazing that it's also the case that what you heard and you saw today from George just really captures a fraction of what George does and has been doing over the last several years at CLS. So I wanted to point out some other major areas of his work, not least his roles as the chief statistician for CLS and as our research director. And amazingly, I found this graphic last night on Twitter, George, which was stating your role. So I was thinking, how am I going to talk through this bit with, with no slide? But anyway, I found the perfect slide for it. So these are both roles he has fairly recently stepped down from, having to move on to greater things, of course, having developed and nurtured them both over several years. So as our research director for CLS, George developed the team from what was a small collection of researchers, mostly contracted to work on individual research projects, to a large, cohesive and collaborative team producing top-class interdisciplinary research, including many, as George has said, as collaborators on much of the research that George has spoken to you about this evening. So as chief statistician, George developed our applied statistical method strategy, which aims to reduce bias from the three major challenges in observational longitudinal data, namely causal inference, measurement error, and missing data. And he's published widely using the cohorts, demonstrating rigorous applications and real advances in each of these. So in his work on missing data, he's made an especially important contribution. So I'll just talk a little bit more about this. And here's reference to one of the seminal published papers from this work, here using the 1958 cohort, demonstrating how we can correct for missing data caused by attrition using the rich information collected over many years in the cohorts from before people dropped out. And so just to go into this a little bit further, and then I promise this will be the last sort of research, hard brain thinking research bit of the evening. Here you can see that despite differential attrition by age 55 in NCDS, that's the 1958 cohort, both according to social class at birth, which is shown on the left-hand panel, and cognitive ability at age 7, which is shown on the right, such that there are disproportionately more high social class from birth participants in the age 55 survey compared to in the complete birth sample, and likewise more cognitively able at age 7 participants in the age 55 survey than there were at birth. Once we've used careful and principled use of multiple imputation and other methods that make use of the rich observable data on the predictors of attrition, or other methods like inverse probability weighting, you can see here, thinking about multiple imputation from the column on the right, labelled MI, that we can restore the sample properties to their original composition on multiple observed dimensions. So his work gives great confidence in the ability to correct for the inevitable attrition in longitudinal studies and produce analyses that are representative of the original target nationally representative populations that our cohorts capture. And that's incredibly important for the science of the studies going forwards. Okay, so for the next part of the talk, I'm going to move away from George's scientific contribution and to talk about George. So this is the bit I've been really looking forward to. So obviously being experts in CLS, in survey design and implementation, I didn't want to make inference about George just based only on a sample size of one, i.e. myself. And so I enlisted the help of a number of current and former colleagues and friends through a short survey that I designed. So the first thing I asked for is 3 words you would use to describe George. Don't wince, George. It's all fine. So I said, trust me, George, so you have to trust me. Okay. So here you can see a word cloud of the results. So as well as some of the most popular words, generous, supportive, knowledgeable, fun, some of the more individual words also help to sum up George. Researcher, rock star, I think that's one of my favourites there. Jumpy, energetic, spirited being some of them. Anyway, I'll leave you to read the rest. And George, I just wanted to say, despite all the times you've told me how handsome and good looking you are, for some reason it didn't come up in the word cloud at all. Okay. So, huh? Hot, yeah, I know, but I know hot isn't about looks, is it? Hot is about, chemistry or something like that. Okay, so I also asked in my survey for anything else you would like to tell me about George. So George, the full results will be available to you. So this question was administered separately to UCL, just to do with the software. It was administered separately to UCL CLS colleagues and to those mainly his former colleagues and friends from outside of UCL. Okay, so and these word clouds group words together, so you can see more about sort of phrasings and not just individual words. So you can see from the UCL CLS colleagues a very important theme coming out there about CLS being very lucky to have George, which, of course, I echo. And from his longer-standing work colleagues and friends, you can see his passion for music and some of the other pursuits of his youth. Lynn mentioned already politics and basketball, which came out here. Also, his youth as an eyeliner-wearing goth, which some of you may already know. Okay, so as part of this survey, I also asked for you to send me pictures. And so linked very strongly to that, here we can see George in his youth and definitely wearing eyeliner in the picture on the top left. You can also see some of his strong musical influences and his rock star tendencies even today. So that's the broom he's holding there on the right, by the way, and not a guitar. Okay. So I also received from some very special photos of his friendships at LSHTM. There you go. And his trip to São Paulo in Brazil. I believe online we may have some listeners from São Paulo. I hope so. And next one here, it's striking how some of George's closest work friends show such a strong resemblance to him. Including here in these pictures with colleagues Richard, Johannes and Dario, all presenting a very similar vibe. Okay. So under George, the CLS research team has become very famous for hosting the legendary CLS Christmas parties in G20 and G03 of 55 to 59 Gordon Square. And here you can see George sporting some especially festive headwear. So last summer we had a 2-day away day for CLS colleagues at Cumberland Lodge. And here I wanted to point out the middle one on the top there. You can see George just about managing to get into the spirit of the very successful drum circle that we made. And finally, George put up a picture from the wonderful event planting trees for the 50th birthdays, together with the study members of the BCS 70. And Lily, here you are again, together with Dad and Mum, so George's wife Nato, who's also deserves an important mention, as well as Mum. Finally, as well as doing the survey, I decided, as many people are doing nowadays, to find out whether ChatGPT could give me any hints and pointers about what to say about George. Okay, so spoiler alert, I would have to say that surveys definitely still win out over AI. You shall see that in a moment. And my prediction, if I may also make one, that in 10 years' time, they still will. Okay, so I started with the question, tell me more about George Ploubidis' Centre for Longitudinal Studies. Now notice this is absolutely true, I have to tell you. And notice I forgot to include the at the before CLS in the very first search I did. Okay, so very alarmingly, this is the response that I got. The George Ploubidis Centre for Longitudinal Studies. Shall I read it out? Based at the University College London in the United Kingdom. So far, so good. Okay, the centre was established in 2018 in honour of Professor George Ploubidis. This is absolutely true. So when I added at the, it actually gave quite a good description of you, George, which I haven't put up. But a renowned researcher, don't worry, children, this didn't happen, who passed away in 2016. The centre aims to build on Professor Ploubidis' legacy by conducting high-quality research that has a real-world impact on people's lives. So clearly I was extremely alarmed about this news. And I racked my brains on where on earth could ChatGPT have come up with this shocking news. So the only thing I could come up with was that researching chronic health issues in middle age seems to have taken its toll on George. As you can see from this clip from primetime BBC TV, where he's talking about his research on multimorbidity in middle age. Okay, so not yet deterred by the quirks of ChatGPT, I also wondered whether it could help me summarize the contents of George's talk. So I took the transcription of our recent Teams meeting between me and George, where he talked me through what he was planning to say in his lecture. And I told ChatGPT to summarize the transcript from that Teams meeting. Okay, so what it told me about the contents of his talk itself wasn't very useful. Like George's talk was much more illuminating. But there was one thing which it did get right, and which everybody who works with George knows, which is his very ample musical references that he uses across life. So this was the actual sort of quote from the summary that it gave me. And I just wanted to say, because I had a sneak peek at George's slides before all of you saw them, that I did spot the musical reference to what is my favourite album when I was growing up in a child, and that's my Stop Making Sense poster that I had on my room. So I just wanted to end talking of musical references with my very own musical reference for you, George. And it's one that, amazingly, I'm pretty sure you will not have heard of. It partly relates to the joke I made earlier about how many times George has told me about how good-looking he is. It's from the brilliant recent Puss in Boots movie. I don't know how many of you in the audience have seen it, but in the opening song, Puss, in striking resemblance to George here, with his gung-ho attitude to work and life in general, and also the second verse lyrics here, his deep belief in social justice. So not only that, of course, we have in the background Myrto, as George's wife, played very aptly in the Puss in Boots movie by the beautiful Selma Hayek. Mm-hmm. And we have Lily protectively tucked under George's arm. So there. So thank you again, George, for your brilliant talk. and for being such a fantastic colleague, research leader and friend. And so all that it leaves me now to do is to channel George here in party mode. I'm sorry that the people online can't join, but I believe the party nibbles and drinks are due to begin. So thank you very much.
Right. So I think that leaves very little for me to say, just to say a huge thanks to Elisa and, of course, to George for that wonderful lecture and for that very fitting and special response, Elisa. So this just leaves me to say a few words of appreciation. Thank you to everyone, to each and every one of you for being here for a very successful professorial lecture. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure all of us did, including those online. And this brings us to the end of our proceedings. Sadly, we must now say goodbye to our friends and online audience. And for those who are here in person, I think we all deserve a very proper toast to this evening's event. So let's continue the conversation over refreshments at the back of this room. Thank you.